There are two main verses that a lot of skeptics use to justify their position of slavery in the Bible. There's about 5 things you can think of that make slavery so morally wrong, and many skeptics believe these two verses teach these things. 1. Being kidnapped and taken against your will. 2. Being stripped of all your rights. 3. The slaver can beat and abuse you as much as he likes since you're his property, which means he's treating you as a thing, not a person. 4. There is no benefit or compensation for you, only for the slaver. And 5, you're forced to stay for life against your will. That treatment of people is horrendous and repulsive. But do these two verses really teach that? Or are skeptics just isolating a verse and reading their own modern understanding of slavery into the passage? The first of these verses is Leviticus 25:44-46.
Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly.
Skeptics believe this passage supports 1. Slaves could be kidnapped from other nations. 2. Slaves could be treated as just property, meaning they don't have any rights and the owner can abuse them and do with them as they please. Foreign slaves are just things instead of people. 3. Foreign slaves were forced to becoming slaves for life against their will. And 4. The Bible only condones slavery when it comes to foreigners. But is that really what the verse is saying? When we look at the Hebrew, the people mentioned in this passage, the Toshab, the sojourners, and also the Gar, the foreigners. The Gar and the Toshab are people who come from another land, who want to find refuge in Israel for one reason or another. Political reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons, such as maybe they embraced Yahweh, or perhaps they ran away from or were exiled from their nation. These people sold themselves into slavery and were not kidnapped against their will, nor was it commanded for them to stay for life. Instead, this was permission. So breaking this down, what is meant by the word property? The biblical word for slave, abed, is a morally neutral word and is not intrinsically negative, and the word property seems to be similar. Skeptics understand the word property in this passage as a word completely derogatory. A person who is property doesn't have any rights. The owner can do with them as they please. The owner can hold them against their will, and the owner can abuse them. And remember, this passage is about the Ger and the Toshab, the sojourners, the foreigner. If we back up just a few chapters in Leviticus 19:33-34, we see where God is talking about the same people, the Toshab, who living as the Ger passage says,
when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you, you must treat them as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
So just a few verses before the passage that skeptics like to isolate and quote, we see the Israelites were commanded not to mistreat them, to love them as they love themselves, and to remember they too once were foreigners. In Exodus 23:9 we read,
do not oppress a foreigner. You yourself know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt.
Exodus 22:21.
Do not mistreat or oppress foreigners, for you yourselves with foreigners in Egypt.
Deuteronomy 27:19.
Cursed is anyone he who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless or the widow.
Deuteronomy 10:19.
For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God who is mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt.
And there are plenty of verses like this. So now, where are the verses where it says you can treat foreigners like an old piece of furniture? Skeptics like to finish that passage on verse 46. But if we pick it up on verse 47, we see not only can these foreign servants become rich, but they could also own other servants. So to get things straight, the Bible says foreigners were not to be oppressed, not to be mistreated. The Israelites were cursed if they withheld justice from the foreigners. Foreigners could become rich and could also own slaves themselves. And the Israelites were commanded to love them. Not just love them, but love them as much as they love themselves. The problem here is skeptics just isolate this verse. They read it with the concept of slavery in their minds that we were all taught at school growing up to prove their point. But if we read more than just this verse, you can put it in context, and it becomes clear that the word property couldn't possibly mean what skeptics believe it to mean. The biblical understanding of the word property from the Hebrew, ahozah, is not in reference to a person's value, but instead it's in reference to their labor output. This is made clear when we continue reading where skeptics leave off in verse 49 to 53. Here it is clear that the redemption price is not based on a person as an object, but instead it's based on their labor output. Given this and dozens of scriptures giving foreigners rights, commanded to be loved and taken care of, and not abused, once we understand what the word can't mean, it helps us understand what the word does mean. It changes the understanding of the language of buying and selling. Similar to today's language when we talk about buying or selling or trading sports players. When we talk about sports players being bought or sold, it doesn't mean they don't have value. Instead, it's referencing to the work that they perform. You can use this language without saying that the person has no value. All you have to do is look at the context in which the language is being used. Skeptics have also taken this verse to mean God has commanded Hebrews not to release foreigners, but it's permission to keep foreigners rather than instructing them to keep foreigners. Take in the context of this verse and what it's talking about. This chapter is talking about the year of Jubilee. The verses right before the passage that skeptics quote, God is talking about the Hebrew servants working till the year of Jubilee, then being released back into their own land. And of the year of Jubilee, all debts are to be wiped out, hitting the reset on the economy. All debts cancelled and everybody goes home. And then the question arises, how does this work for the foreigner when they don't have any land to go back to? And if most or all of them can't go back to their own home for whatever reason? Here God is giving them permission to stay permanently if they wish. Notice the language here. God isn't commanding them to stay for life. In the passage, God is saying you can or you may. It's permission He's giving. He's not saying you must or you shall. He's giving permission. It's not like earlier in Leviticus where God commanded the Israelites by saying, you shall love them as you love yourself, and you must treat the foreigner living among you as native born. If we survey the words tobas and gur, there are only a few times where there were exceptions for foreigners, and in those times it was directly related to the land. So it had nothing to do with race because it was about land. So if foreigners wanted to come and stay, they could. And this isn't as grim as skeptics would like to make out, especially because Israelites were commanded to love them and treat them good, not oppress them and so on. So nowhere in that verse does it say that foreigners were kidnapped and brought to Israel against their will. The only way that this could seem like a possibility is if the skeptics have a modern idea of slavery in their minds when reading this passage. And having to stay there for life against your will makes no sense when in Deuteronomy we read,
You shall not deliver to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you, among you, in the place which he shall choose within one of your gates, where it pleases him best. You shall not oppress him.
Here we see that the Israelites were commanded to take in runaway slaves, not to return them to their masters, and the slave could stay wherever he liked and not to oppress them. And in Exodus 21:5-6,
But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life.
To which the skeptic may believe God is only talking about the Hebrew slaves. But if that's the case, that flies in the face of the scripture skeptics like to use. That is also Exodus 21.
Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property.
There is nowhere in this verse where it says it is in reference to the Hebrew slaves. God's laws are for everyone, and if there's going to be any difference between the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew, then the passage will specify. Otherwise, it's referring to the laws of Israel, and everybody living in Israel is under the law. Skeptics, once again, are reading this verse out of context and inserting their modern idea of slavery into the context. Let's just read the verse that comes after this one.
Anyone who has a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye, and an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth.
So what we see here is slaves can go free if they're abused. So it's just wrong to say that slaves can be beaten mercilessly and forced to stay, rather than just isolating one verse. If skeptics just took the time to read a few more verses after 20 and 21, then they would realize how wrong they are. The passages couldn't possibly mean that you could beat your slave within an inch of their life, and if they survive, you get away with it scot-free, because we now have a passage that says there is punishment if you beat your slave. So what's happening here in verses 20 and 21? Let's read it again.
Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result 21. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property.
The word being used here for punish in Hebrew is nakam, which is specifically talking about the death penalty, as it does every other time in the Old Testament. So all this passage is saying is that if you kill a slave, you get the death penalty. You take a life, you lose a life for a life. But if the slave doesn't lose their life, then it's not a life for a life. The death penalty is not required. There's nothing special about an eye or a tooth. The passage is saying you can't beat your slaves. So you can see here that skeptics who just isolate a Bible verse and try and make it mean what they want it to mean really miss the true context of what the passage is saying. And on top of what the passage is really saying, common sense says if you hurt or kill your slave, you don't benefit. You've lost your worker. You have to do the work yourself and you don't get paid. You simply don't win in that situation. Ultimately, there is no Hebrew word for the word slave in the Bible. The word being used is abed, which comes from the root word abad, which means to work or to serve. Abed is a worker or a servant. Just like the word gay has a completely different meaning to what it used to mean years ago, so too the slavery in the Bible means something completely different to what we now know as modern day slavery.